Recording has been started now.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Dr. Adityanji, and on behalf of the Council for Strategic Affairs, I invite all of you to our monthly roundtable discussion. Those of you who registered using our flyer probably saw this with the pictures of our distinguished panelists. Just to show the two countries that CSA is very involved with. But today's topic is Indo-Pacific, IORA, and maritime challenges, aka regional security concern. Just for the sake of record, today is Saturday, July 1st, 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, Washington, D.C., 7:30 p.m. Indian Standard Time, and 11 p.m. for Japanese time, because one of our distinguished panelists is from Japan. A little bit about Council for Strategic Affairs. Council for Strategic Affairs imparts education in the field of international relations. CSA fosters discussion, dialogue, and debate on geopolitical issues. CSA encourages strategic studies in general to raise the level of awareness. CSA condemns terrorism in all forms anywhere in the world, and CSA aims to contribute towards world peace and prosperity. And our web address is www.councilforstrategicaffairs.org. So our activities include a monthly roundtable discussion. Usually it is held on second Saturday of each month at 10 a.m., this month being an exception. We have a monthly guest lecture by a domain expert on fourth Saturday of every month. Organize symposia, meetings, and conferences. We promote publications of articles on geopolitics and related subjects. We have a summer internship program for college students, and we have a CSA fellowship training program in strategic studies, and we have one of our fellows who started from June 1st. So today's distinguished panelists are Ambassador Anil Trigunayat. He's a retired IFS officer from India. Professor Sato Yoichiro is a political scientist from Japan, and Commodore R. Sheshadri Vasan, who is a retired naval personnel from Indian Navy. Let me introduce the panelists. Ambassador Anil Trigunayat has been a professional Indian diplomat for over 3 decades, serving India's national interests across continents, from Asia to Africa to Europe, Americas, including Russia and USA. And just now I found out that he had 2 tours of duty in Russia. Prior to his superannuation in 2016, he served as India's ambassador to Jordan, Libya, and Malta. He has studied in Agra, in Kumaon, and Jawaharlal Nehru University. He also did research work at Oxford University on WTO and regional trading blocs. He is a regular commentator on foreign affairs and prolific writer. Currently, apart from his association with various think tanks, strategy groups, and chambers of commerce and industries in India and abroad, he is a distinguished fellow with the prestigious Vivekananda International Foundation, heading their West Asia expert groups. His key areas of interest include West Asia, Africa, Russia, serving India's interests in conflict zones. Recently, government has appointed him as an independent director on the board of WAPCOS as a mini Ratna government company. The Peace Ambassador with Unity Earth Australia, as well as Rotarian serving the society. Apart from writing hundreds of articles, opinion pieces, and commentaries on foreign issues in leading magazines, newspapers, he has edited a recent book on evolving security dynamics in West Asia and India's challenges, published by VIF and Pentagon Press, and it is available on Amazon. And that's the picture of our distinguished guest, Anil Trigunayat. Our second distinguished guest is Professor Yoichiro Sato. He is a Japanese political scientist. He holds a BA in law from Keio University, an MA in International Studies from University of South Carolina, and PhD from in Political Science from University of Hawaii. He is currently at Ritsumeikan Asia Pacific University. Previously, he has taught at the US Department of Defense, Asia Pacific Center for Security Studies, and Auckland University in New Zealand. He has been visiting professor at multiple institutions. He has more than 10 published books that include US-Japan Security Alliance that he co-edited with Takashi Inoguchi and G. John Eikenberry. Regional institutions, geopolitics and economics in Asia Pacific, and Re-Rising Japan. These are some of the titles of his books. His commentaries have appeared in various global media, including Time Magazine, Newsweek, Al Jazeera, Agence Presse Française, and Nikkei Asian Review. And that's the picture of Professor Sato. He very graciously agreed to participate in this roundtable discussion, knowing very well that it will be past 11 p.m. in Japan, and right now he is in Guam, and it's even further into the midnight. So I'm highly thankful to him. Our last panelist is Commodore R. Sheshadri Vasan. Commodore Vasan is a retired naval officer with combined distinguished experience of 34 years from Navy and the Coast Guard, which includes staff, command, and instructional appointments. To name a few, the appointments include Regional Commander of the Coast Guard Regional East, Chief Staff Officer Operations of Southern Naval Command, Commanding Officer of 2 naval air stations, a naval air squadron, warships, etc. He has more than 9 years of think tank experience, and he is director of the prestigious Chennai Center for China Studies, a China-focused think tank based in Chennai, India. He's also working in the field of strategy and security, international relations, with a view to contribute to understanding of these issues, as well as to provide policy alternatives to stakeholders of any description. His specialties include maritime and naval aviation background, conferences, seminars. He has been conducting workshops in these topics and has been writing prolifically in the media. And this is Commodore Vasan. He has been kind enough to come to our platform whenever we have requested. So, format for the roundtable discussion is that each panelist will be given 5 minutes for their opening statement, followed by a period of moderated discussion for almost 35 to 40 minutes, and last 20 minutes would be question and answers from the audience. So there are some housekeeping rules. Please mute yourself to avoid noise interference. Please change your cell phone setting to vibration mode. Please do not try to interrupt our esteemed speakers when they are speaking. Only those members of the audience who identify themselves openly will be asked to pose questions. No anonymous questioners, please. All the questions have to be sent into the chat room. I would appreciate if people are sending specific questions, not detailed comments. Finally, we are simultaneously broadcasting this on YouTube, so it is available immediately on YouTube and possibly some of other social media platform. It will be available on our website as well as on our YouTube channel. And lastly, this is the map of the Indo-Pacific, just I put for sake of reference. So without further ado, I'm going to invite Ambassador Anil Trigunayat to give his opening statement. Ambassador Trigunayat, please give 5 minutes of your opening statement, and then I will invite another panelist.
Thank you, Dr. Adityanji, for inviting me along with highly distinguished panelists at this very important webinar by the CSA. Namaskar to everyone. With Indo-Pacific has become one of the most contested, congested, and complex theaters of competition between the superpowers, especially the Sino-US competition that we are seeing increasingly acquiring the hostile tones. And in every theater that you look at, the impact of the Pacific and the various alignments that are taking place and the alliances are creating some kind of a flutter into the Chinese minds, I guess, and their behavior. Of course, China has called upon itself because it has followed, and it's always a dragon in the room, as we call it, and because it has followed in hegemonistic policy, it has more territorial disputes with the countries than it has boundaries with. And it has, so this America, USA, which is the superpower, hyperpower at the moment, is overall feeling threatened also by the by the Chinese hegemonistic behavior, especially in the Indo-Pacific. As far as India is concerned, you know that we also share a long boundary with them. The Chinese have hostile acts that are perpetrated on our borders. The Indo-Pacific emergence, in fact, there's an idea, can be said to have emanated by various sources. Most prominently, it was spoken about by late Japanese Prime Minister Abe when he addressed the Indian Parliament and they talked about the confluence of the two oceans. And subsequently, from Asia Pacific, it is converted into the India Pacific. And what I would like to say is that it is so important that today in every theater that we are talking about is discussed. We have seen Prime Minister Modi when he spoke at the US Congress, and he had spoken earlier at the Shangri-La Dialogue when he outlined India's policy. And so he said there at the US Congress only just last week, he said, we share a vision of a free, open, and inclusive Indo-Pacific, connected by secure seas, defined by international law, free from domination, and anchored in ASEAN centrality. A region where all nations, small and large, are free and fearless in their choices, where progress is not suffocated by impossible burdens of debt, connectivity is not leveraged for strategic purposes, where all nations are lifted by the high tide of shared prosperity. The vision does not seek to contain or exclude, but to build a cooperative region of peace and prosperity. Work through regional institutions and with our partners from within the region and beyond of this. So India also is a resident power in the Indian Ocean, therefore is exercising its options, and the compass is very different from what the US compass is as far as the Indo-Pacific is concerned. It feeds from Eastern Africa to the Western Indian Ocean region, and now, of course, into the Horn of Africa and moving into the Indo-Pacific. We have seen Prime Minister Modi recently visiting Papua New Guinea, where a third FIPIC conference was also held, and India came out with this 12-point plan. That small Pacific island nations are also becoming another area of contestations. We have seen the Quad that has come out from the doldrums and the slumbers to a very active format where 3 summit-level meetings have already been held. The last one was at Hiroshima. We have seen, and everywhere was a thing that no country dominates and no country is dominated, is the theme that goes on. Law, free and open Indo-Pacific, international law and order, very important. We are also seeing the AUKUS and as well as I would say the new Quad, with India, with the USA, Philippines, Australia, and Japan, also converging with the different. So there is one Quad in which India is a partner with Japan and Australia and the US. There is another Quad that is emerging. It is more securitized, but security guarantees and agreements are very much there. I feel that this is going to continue to remain a very major area of contestation where countries will continue to exercise their influence. We will see greater leveraging of their powers in the maritime domain, trying to contain. And Taiwan remains a very major flashpoint. And if something happens in Taiwan, I feel that this region is going to become far more difficult to contain. Its fallout would be very difficult. India is also a leader in the Indian Ocean region, and IORA initiative is very much a part of its thing. And there we are seeing, as you know, the climate change and the oceans have been the carbon sink basically for the world and are also crying now. Therefore, it is very important to look at the climate change as a very major challenge in the oceans, especially the Indian Ocean, where the large 80% of the world's trade moves through. And we have this blue economy that could, if survived, provide a lot of good for the world. So I'll stop here in 5 minutes, I think, is over. And I will be very happy to answer any questions thereafter.
Thank you very much indeed, Ambassador Anil Trigunayat. You did what they call in Hindi, Gagar mein sagar bharna. That is to put the ocean into a pot. That is what you did very beautifully in 5 minutes time. Now it is my distinct pleasure to invite Professor Sato to give his opening statement. Sir, kindly unmute yourself. You are muted right now. So
Thank you very much for inviting me to this very prestigious forum. I'd first like to call your attention to this growing tension between China and the United States, which is increasingly dictating the course of the region. The security architecture of the post-Cold War period spawned numerous all-inclusive multilateral forums such as the ASEAN Regional Forum, ARF, and Asian Defense Ministers Meeting, plus ADMM+. However, recent bifurcating tendency is growing in the region. Both security and economic groupings, as you have observed in the competing free trade agreements, as well as competing security groupings. The security groupings, the Quad, the first Quad, US, Japan, Australia, and India, identifies China as a common concern. And this is a growing development as China's behavior in the region is very assertive against the regional neighbors. Meanwhile, China's approaches towards Russia and also China's attempt to exploit every opportunity to befriend anti-American states like Iran and also drive a wedge among US friends and allies have intensified. The Indo-Pacific is destined to be the center of economic gravity in the remainder of the 21st century. European states have renewed their interest in this region, starting with participations in naval coalition operations in the Operation Enduring Freedom against Taliban smuggling in the Indian Ocean region, and the anti-piracy patrol and escort missions of Somalia and the Sea of Aden. The European states have taken part in collective security efforts in the Indian Ocean region. European interests have taken place in multiple forms. First, in bilateral forms of cooperation between one European state and one state either in the region or the external partners. Recently, we have seen countries like France cooperating with India, and this is the case of a bilateral cooperation. Whereas other trilateral forms have also emerged, and as the ambassador collectively pointed out, the AUKUS formulation, Australia, UK, US, is growing in terms of tangible cooperation, and other trilateral formulations are also emerging. In the case of 3 of the Quad members, oftentimes jointly conducting military exercise. Japanese have also increased its activities in this region, and its emphasis has shifted from first trilateral security dialogue, US, Japan, Australia, to the quadrilateral cooperation today. And also the emphasis has shifted from non-traditional security during the early days of trilateral security dialogue to more concrete threat of China today. Japan has also tried to bridge the cooperation within Quad or the trilateral configuration with ASEAN interests, especially by paying great respect to ASEAN outlook for the Indo-Pacific by taking in some of its priorities into Japan's new concept of free and open Indo-Pacific. With India, again, Japan also coordinated by downplaying the military rivalry against China and emphasizing the economic prosperity of the region. Given all that, the challenge for Indian Ocean Rim Association is its diversity. The multilateral engagement through this forum possible, given that there are so many small member states, the interests may or may not converge with major players in and out of the region. Inclusivity is both a curse and a blessing, and I think the major challenge is first of all the diverse interest among South Asian neighbors. For European inclusion, this is a great opportunity to counterbalance the bilateral arrangements Europeans have undertaken so far. The Australian engagement through this forum is also very useful and important. What to do with the United States and Japan? They are extra-regional players of great importance. So this dialogue needs to be enhanced. Is there a middle power diplomacy useful for this engagement purpose? Australia, India, several other countries, key countries, Indonesia, what can they do? Those are some of the things we need to keep eyes on. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Sato, for your wisdom and the challenges you have thrown in this discussion, and we will follow through. I really appreciate your opening comments because you have raised a number of issues and hopefully we'll be able to discuss them. Now it's my distinct pleasure to invite Commodore R. Sheshadri Vasan, who has been on our platform before, and he is the director of Chennai Center for China Studies. A central theme of this discussion So, Ambassador Commodore Vasan, the floor is yours, sir. Namaskar.
Thank you, Dr. Adityaji, Professor Sato, Ambassador Trigonath, and all the panelists who are here. It's always an honor to be part of these discussions. The high quality has been maintained, and from the interactions in the past that I have participated, it's very clear that there is focused attention to the issues at hand. Coming to today's topic, I think the previous presentations by the two panelists have made it clear that it is Indo-Pacific that will be central to all our discussions in the coming decades. Not necessarily only because it's the century of the sea, but it's also because of the developments that have taken place, particularly in the last 10 years or so. It can also be aligned with Xi Jinping assuming power in 2013 and launching many of the schemes. So unfortunately for China, I would say a lot of these calculations have not gone according to their plan. And that has perhaps opened up windows for other players to come together, whether it's the Indo-Pacific Ocean Initiative, whether it's the Quad, whether it is the Indo-Pacific Economic Forum. A lot of these essentially have come together to take on China. Whether we like it or not, it has to be made clear that all this is about ensuring that China is made to behave. It's not demonstrated a responsible behavior commensurate with its aspirations. It wants to be the number one global power, but its behavior, whether it's in the East China Sea or in the South China Sea, or for that matter along the LAC, where we are directly affected, does not show that it has any respect for rule-based order. This is why all the partner nations of the Quad have clearly said we are looking at a rule-based order. That's very important to say what are these rules and what is it that we want China to comply with. The clear violation of the PCA in 2016, when the PCA gave the verdict against China and in favor of Philippines, it did not even take cognizance of this. Likewise, within the East China Sea and South China Sea, they are using the military militia. Use of this power to prevent other fishermen from carrying out fisheries expeditions in their own exclusive economic zone. So all this does not behave well for China. But China, in my opinion, has to blame itself for bringing together various like-minded people and the democracies, and therefore opening up many avenues. India, I think, is in the center of all these developments that are taking place because of its market size, because of the demography, because of its democratic credentials, because of the leadership that we have witnessed in the last 8-9 years. So this has demonstrated that countries who are like-minded and in democratic front can provide alternatives to China's power, whether it's economic power or the military muscle flexing that it has demonstrated in the area. From India's point of view, we are definitely concerned about its ingress into Indian Ocean region. We have certain legitimate compulsions, but the military base in Djibouti, Gwadar, and the so-called string of pearls that it has indulged in, through also the BRA. BRA is something which is now virtually failed in many of these areas, and these were things that are of great concern to India, which ensured that it did not join this bandwagon of BRA. It abstained from the BRF, and so therefore the actions of India, including the abrogation of Article 370 internally, which is an internal issue, all these have made China look up to India as not necessarily just a competitor, but somebody who's a stumble block in its global initiatives. So when I talk about global initiatives, we must also lay emphasis on what has been done in terms of the Global Development Initiative, the Global Security Initiative, and the Global Cultural Initiative. You must grant it to the Chinese, they are quite wise and imaginative in their approach. So these are basically various initiatives aimed at getting more people on their side. It's a different matter that it's not happening because when you look at the list of friends that China has and other countries who are there, look at, you can realize that there are hardly any friends except North Korea and maybe even Pakistan, certain terms which are there. So I would like to wind up here and have more time for discussions, except to say that not only the Indo-Pacific is at the center of the global planetary, because of the geographic location which India is blessed with, India and the Indian Ocean region are central pivots to whatever is likely to unfold in the coming decades. And China, again, whether you like it or not, is a force that is to be reckoned with. India, on its part, has realized that it cannot do it alone. So is Japan and so is Australia. So together, we are able to take on the economic might. And this has also resulted in tech wars, semiconductor wars, resilient supply chain initiatives. All these are things that will have long gestation periods. Overnight, you cannot delete from China. But these are all works in progress. And India is very happy to be in the center of these initiatives which are there, and to both gain from it and to contribute as a responsible part in the community of nations. Thank you.
Thank you, Commodore Vasan. So all three of our distinguished panelists have given their opening statements, and we go on to our second kind of phase, which is moderated discussion, in which I will be asking questions, different questions to each of the three panelists. But before I do that, I just want to make one issue very clear. The term Indo-Pacific is not new. Actually, this term was first introduced by a German politician in the 1920s when he wrote a book on Indo-Pacific. So although it has caught on now, people were talking about Asia-Pacific and all, but there is in last 10 years more emphasis on Indo-Pacific. The concept of Indo-Pacific is nothing new. So I will start with my first question, and my first question goes to Ambassador Trigunayat, and I know that you recently wrote an article on the newer Quad involving Philippines. Now, instead of having multiple of these structures, multiple layers of these structures, and keeping in view India's open expression of concern with China about India wanting China to request the 2016 PCA arbitration ruling, would it not make sense, instead of recreating another Quad, to invite Philippines into Quad and make Quad into either Quad Plus or Pentagon? Ambassador Trigunayat.
Dr. Altianji, yes, common sense says it will. As you know, that all the other countries, be it Japan, be it Australia, or be it Philippines, they have with the US a direct security relationship, which is an agreement with them. And we don't have that kind of alliance system. And therefore, India, even if it is in the Quad, and which was actually called the Quad Security Dialogue, had a somewhat different position as far as dealing with China is concerned. India has not subscribed to the idea of containing China. It has spoken about Prime Minister Modi at Shangri-La in 2018, and then now again he has spoken about inclusive China, wanting China to behave as per the international rules of order. Now, the Philippines, as you know, had directly suffered from the Chinese invest in 2016. An award was given to them by the International Court of Justice, which China simply disregarded. Secondly, when we talk of ASEAN centrality, and rightly so, the fact remains is that the ASEAN countries themselves very often are not going to be the front runners of this strategy of the United States or the Quad or other countries. So each one, and China is able to create some kind of a dissonance even there. We have seen that when the ASEAN countries are recently launched their naval exercises in the South China Sea, I think the Cambodia and some other countries have opted out of it. So there is, the China says a code of conduct they want to discuss with the ASEAN countries and within the ASEAN. So it considers USA and others as external powers. You have seen with the recently held Shangri-La dialogue, the kind of respect that happened between Ling Fu, the Chinese defense minister, and Secretary Austin. And where there were all kinds of questions were asked, the international rules-based order, whose rule-based order, who creates this order. So China wants to create its own kind of an order or disorder. And therefore, it is a situation. So you're right. I mean, it is possible. But then even Japan, Australia, or USA also don't say that this Quad is against China, even though they mean it. in that very manner. So I think that this is more of semantics, and the real strategy, my feeling is that if and when you have a very volatile situation like a war in the region, then perhaps all these can synchronize in a better way.
Thank you, Ambassador Trigunayak. Komodo Watson, did you want to make a comment?
Just want to add on to what Ambassador Trigunayak has explained so well, is to say that, in addition to that, you don't have to necessarily look at these alignments, because bilaterally we are doing a lot with the neighbors of China. For example, Philippines is the only country where we are, exporting the BrahMos. And just yesterday, you saw the road news that one of our warship, a commissioned warship, INS Kukri, which is built indigenously, is going to Vietnam. So it's also about shoring up the capabilities of these neighbors to be able to, look at their own interests, particularly in the exclusive economic zone. Because each of these, whether it's Philippines or Vietnam, Brunei, all these people have disputes within the exclusive economic zone. So indirectly, you are contributing to the mission of shoring up their strength to take on the military militia or whatever else that's being put against them.
Thank you, Komodo Watson. My next question goes to Professor Sato. Kindly unmute yourself, sir. Professor Sato, United States advised recently to the ASEAN to resolve intra-ASEAN disputes the ASEAN countries have amongst themselves, so that they can focus with a single voice on China or its hegemonic ambitions. Now, in the similar vein, Japan has island disputes with Russian Federation on Kuril Islands. Japan has island dispute with China on Senkaku versus what they call Diaolu Islands. Japan also has island dispute with South Korea on what they call Dokdo Islands and what Japan calls Takeshima Islands. In the same spirit, if in East Asia, some disputes have to be resolved to focus on the main maritime security challenge, in a grand bargain in Indo-Pacific, would Japan be willing to consider a kind of settlement in which Taiwan renounces the claim on Senkaku Islands, which it has? Taiwan and South Korea support Japan on its claims on Senkaku Islands as well as Kuril Islands. As a confidence building measure, Japan agrees to settle the Takeshima/Dokdo Island dispute in favor of South Korea. What are your thoughts on that?
Thank you very much for a very interesting question. Territorial issues are really sacrosanct for any state, and Japan is no exception to that. Having said that, however, Japan is realistic enough that islands which are already occupied by foreign forces are extremely difficult to come back to Japanese sovereignty. So with Korea, yes, the dispute remains on the book, but Japan has not challenged Korea's active control by any means other than diplomatic protests from time to time. Those protests happen only when the Koreans are pushing envelope, like Prime Minister landing on the disputed island and so forth. Japan fully understands that those are primarily driven by Korea's domestic politics, which has a spillover effects onto Korean diplomacy towards Japan. So Japanese response to this dispute has been very modest and very much in control. Russia-Japan Prime Minister Abe had a hope that the bilateral summit meeting with Putin would probably result in some Russian concession great hope and organized a very private meeting in his home prefecture at the traditional inn. And not so surprising, however, Putin showed up to the meeting late, and it's quite a common Russian negotiation tactic. And despite Japan's effort to even conduct this meeting after Russia annexed Crimea, and Europeans wanted Japan not to meet Putin. Despite all these efforts, Russia didn't come forward with any concession, and Japan joined the anti-Russian sanction together with Europeans and Americans. So the hope for any early settlement of the territorial dispute is gone. China is a different story because Japan still holds administrative control over those islands without landing anybody to the island. Japanese Coast Guard has been patrolling the area and preventing the Chinese activists from landing onto the island, or at least not to expel, but Chinese Coast Guard vessels have been incurring into the territorial water around the islands, and Japan is trying to prevent Chinese patrol ships from enforcing any kind of fishery regulation against the Japanese fishing boat within the territorial water of the disputed island. So the situation is very tense as Chinese are increasing the presence in terms of number of ships and the number of hours those ships are staying inside the territorial water. The Coast Guard of Japan is trying to match the Chinese presence so that nothing will become a customary law.
Thank you, Professor Sato. My next question goes to Komodo Watson. Komodo Watson, Ambassador Tregunayat talked about centrality of ASEAN countries, and Professor Sato talked about, IORA being so diverse that, there is no commonality about the security challenges or maritime threat challenges. My question to you is that IORA has so far focused on sustainable development, taking projects, climate change issues, etc., etc. Yes, it is a grouping of 23 countries, but hasn't the time arrived that instead of harping on centrality of ASEAN Indo-Pacific, we try to engage other stakeholders also? And to my mind, IORA is a stakeholder in the concept of Indo-Pacific and Indo-Pacific security. So would it be appropriate for IORA this time for the next Indian Ocean Dialogue to discuss maritime security challenges? And would it make sense for countries like Japan to engage in an institutional framework with IORA to increase the economic, commercial, and developmental activities in IORA country to make it a strong contender and a strong player in Indo-Pacific? Dr. Watson, please.
That's a very valid question in terms of the utility of IORA. As so many members are there, 23 members plus, there's some 12 odd observers there. Point is that the focus has not there been about security. It's more about shoring up economic arrangements, blue economy, climate change, all these which are being discussed in many other forums too. So to bring in the aspect of centrality of the Indian Ocean region, I think all these members who are there, whose shores are washed by the Indian Ocean, need to shift their gears in terms of how they want to shape the narrative in the Indian Ocean region. So this has not happened. So you correctly identified that perhaps there is now a felt need to see that these members change, in fact, by a consensus on what more should they be investing. Because, at the moment it is China-driven banking instruments, like the BRICS fund, where they have a major stake, or the ADB or the AIIB. So all these places are very important for developing countries. Where the IORA does not have a fund of this nature. Maybe it's time to suggest to them that all of them should start putting some money where their mouth is, and create a separate IORA fund, which will look at the developmental issues in IORA, which will provide not necessarily a competition, but an alternative to the BRI initiative by China. So this will also help these countries which are there, with the support of Japan, USA, Australia, UK are already the Quad partners. All these people to come together and ensure that the complete narrative in the IORA is now changed, consistent with the new challenges that have come about with the centrality of Indo-Pacific. No, you did mention about ASEAN. We realized that just as we say that India is central to the Indian Ocean region, anything that happens in ASEAN continues to be central to the developments in the Pacific region. So because ASEAN as a bloc has a phenomenal amount of clout, it has deep relations with China. China depends on the ASEAN countries for many of its economic surges. And that's why India also has realized this, which is why the press keenly noted the fact that Indian Navy exercised with the ASEAN members. So these are some of the initiatives that are of great relevance in ensuring that India as the central pivot point in the Indian Ocean region, and ASEAN, which is central to the happens in the Pacific, both work in tandem, not just necessarily in silos as IORA and ASEAN bloc or ADMM plus or whatever, but try and synergize their context and contextualize the happenings for the next 10 years or so. So I think time is ripe enough for them to change their tack and look at what more can be done together, more in terms of the economic alternatives that are required to be provided.
Thank you, Commodore Vasan. I personally agree with your answer and your views on this, that time has come for IORA to face the stark challenges that we face in Indian Ocean at this point in time. My next question goes to Ambassador Trigunayat. It may appear to be a bilateral question, but it is actually not bilateral because it has bearings on the maritime security of entire Indo-Pacific. Our neighbor, Sri Lanka, has an external debt of $40 billion. Out of those $40 billion, 20%, approximately $8 billion is owed to China in a very, one-sided debt trap agreements, forcing Sri Lanka to give 99 years lease on Hambantota port. With Sri Lankan economy going south, India had to intervene and give various tranches of loan. In last 6 to 8 months, India has given $4 billion to Sri Lanka. If you look at the scales, that is 50% of the debt owed to China. Does it not make sense for Indian government to come to some sort of bargain with Sri Lanka, buy out all the Chinese debt of $8 billion, to take control of Hambantota port?
It's a very interesting question. In fact, currently, as you know, the Sri Lanka is going through a financial meltdown. And that is something which India has tried to salvage the Chinese economy and the people in the spirit of neighborhood first policy, essentially, our historic ties with them, as well as a strategic choice that India made in order to get in there when the Chinese were not even willing to defer the payments of interest, at the time. They took a very long time to do so. The question is that all our neighbors, even though we have a neighborhood first policy, you need to understand that most of them are democracies. The parties keep on changing one after the other, and we have seen that their preferences also change. Secondly, they have also begun to use this metrics between India and China to their own advantage, negotiating advantage essentially, taking assistance from both sides. So even as recently, as last month, I think the Sri Lankans said that they would like to maintain good relations with China. And likewise in Nepal, in other countries. So China has this string of pearls strategy, as was mentioned earlier, which basically to maintain India within the region itself and not go beyond it. That's it. India has started its own strategy, which is called Sagar. The concept is very different. The concept is for security and growth for all in the region, everyone. So we'll have to somehow find a way of not only just pay off. We have done, as you know, this was done very similarly in Maldives' case, that they also had a very huge Chinese debt, which India helped by extending a line of credit to them. Very often, the country feels that I would not like to create new dependencies. Right. So while you have one dependency, you don't want to create the another dependency. Secondly, China only weeks ago, I think, has invested another $450 million in another project in Sri Lanka. So they have strategically taken it. While India or any other country might like to give this money, I mean, there are Japanese are interested there. We are doing a project together. There are the Sri Lanka Americans are interested in Sri Lanka. None of them have come up with this idea to pay off the Chinese debts. So China says, very simply put, that you came to us, you wanted this money, these were the terms, you signed on it. Then if you're not able to pay, this was part of the bargain. Now we call it debt trap diplomacy or whatever you may. That's how China has been operating. So what happens in most countries? We see that if Africa also very similar situation. But then how many places, which places? Because China is going to be our challenge in every geography.
Thank you, Ambassador Trigunayat. Just a comment to you that, I mean, we have to start thinking differently. By continuing to pour money into Maldives and Sri Lanka, we are subsidizing China against us. So instead of continuing to do more of the same that does not work, you have to think of other strategies and other tactics. But I'll give a word to Commodore Watson, who wants to make a comment. Commodore Watson, please.
Thank you. Just to complement what Ambassador Trigunayat said, because I was in Sri Lanka about 2 months ago, I interacted with some other think tank officials there. And, the sense that I get is that as far as Sri Lanka is concerned, they will play the India card in China, the China card in India, and try and derive the maximum benefit. The question of taking over Hambantota altogether does not exist for one simple reason, that the contractual obligations are so stringent. That if you want to say that I will now foreclose all the contract, then it's virtually not possible, because Chinese are very good at drawing up their contracts. So, there should be no illusions about being able to take over. And even if that option comes about, it may not be 8 billion, it may be 80 billions. So how are we going to do that? So, they are very, very clever. So we must grant the Chinese that wisdom which has been nurtured for decades, where they know how to draw up contracts. And but Sri Lanka, which is there, I spent about 5 days there, going around the country. People are to certain extent disillusioned that all this investment does not create job opportunities for them. It's at the lower spectrum, because the high skilled laborers, the equipment, everything, something like 80% of the contract that they draw in any project goes back to China. So the actual benefit for the countries where investments are taking place is in the region of 15 to 20%, which is not good for a developing country. So Sri Lanka also realizes, and India, has always risen to the occasion as the first responder, whether it's water crisis in Maldives, whether it is clearance of Galle after tsunami, or whether it's the bailout now. They realize the importance of India as a big, a benign neighbor, but they're not able to get out of the clutches of China. because of the huge investments that China has made and the contractual obligations. I thought I'll bring it to your notice because I just visited Sri Lanka about 2 months ago.
Thank you, Komodo Watson. My next question goes to Professor Sato. Kindly unmute yourself, sir. Professor Sato, you mentioned that both Japan and United States have no locus standi as far as IORA is concerned. Prime Minister Abe was very far-sighted when he enunciated the concept of quadrilateral security dialogue. And one of the critiques of Quad by China is that it is inspired by US hegemonic designs. Now, in order for Japan to work, the stakeholders in the region would the government of Japan or any leader of Japan consider working with some of the regional countries to create a new multilateral maritime security mechanism. I have a specific mechanism in mind, and I call it SKIJA. South Korea, India, Indonesia, Japan, and Australia. So there's no question of US hegemonic designs. And we have actually in the Quad left out, both the Quads left out South Korea and Indonesia. So a kind of Indo-Pacific countries security grouping in which Japan is an equal partner, but other players are also included. Any comments, Professor Sato?
Okay, thank you very much. I think for Japan, the bilateral alliance with the United States is the real backbone of its strategy, and any other bilateral, trilateral, multilateral formations are being sought for the purpose of complementing this main security strategy with the United States, if necessary, to supplement it when the U.S. interest and capabilities seem to be declining, then soliciting additional powers to supplement this bilateral alliance is important. But also, by soliciting additional partners, Japan is trying to anchor U.S. interest and commitment to the region, because Japan itself is seemingly a declining power as far as the relative economic ranking is concerned, and as far as the future demographic projections are concerned. So Japan's utility to the United States as an ally, if I may borrow the words of Brad Grossaman, peaked. He named his book Peak Japan. His book and my book came out around the same time, and I had a great debate about this, whether Japan has peaked or not. But for declining Japan, inviting additional partners to work with the U.S. to cement U.S. commitment to the region is key part of the strategy. So any kind of a multilateral or minilateral formations for the purpose of creating an alternative to the US-Japan alliance is not what Japan is seeking.
Thank you, Professor, for your honesty, but it may be a little myopic because you have to involve with the middle powers in the region. And as they say in international relations, that international relations are not a zero-sum game. So your alliance with other middle powers may not be at the expense of United States, but that's a separate question. I'll go to my next question, and that is to Komodo Watson. Komodo Wasan, everyone knows about Chinese maritime threats in the Indo-Pacific, in South China Sea. That story is very well known. China owns the largest navy at this point in time in number of assets. China has ambition to get what it is called TSN, 1,000 ships navy. And Chinese forays into Indian Ocean do present sort of challenge to Indian security interests. Chinese bases, naval bases, also pose security challenges to us. At this juncture, should not India go for a rapid naval expansion instead of treating the Navy as the Cinderella and go into building capacities? If those capacities were to be built on a rapid expansion plan, how should India prioritize the investment? Should it be in the nuclear submarines or more, carrier formations, aircraft carrier formations? As a retired naval person, if you were advising the government of India, and if money was not the limiting factor, let's say money was not the limiting factor, how to go about Indian naval expansion, counter the Chinese threat?
Very interesting question, particularly if you tell me that there is no problem about funds, then sky is also not a limit. But bringing back the focus on the current trends of development, etc. By and large, I think though it's been a Cinderella service, with average budget allocation of 15 to 18%, we've done fairly well in terms of our own indigenization effort. As was demonstrated with the building of the first carrier INS Vikrant, which luckily I was on board on September last year to witness this event. So I think we have come a long way in terms of our ability to stand on our own. It's not that we are fully capable of making our own weapon systems and sensors. Hull is fine, but weapons and sensors we are still dependent on Western technology. So from that point of view, if you have to look at countering China in the maritime domain, luckily again I go back to the advantages that geography has conferred on India. But Andaman Nicobar, those are your forward posts. No other country has this kind of forward posts as assets. And there we have the only tri-services command. Today we are talking about theater commands, and that will become a reality soon. But in way back in 20 years ago, we brought the first joint command in Andaman Nicobar. So obviously, so we are well poised in terms of equipping and being ready for the Chinese challenge in the Indian Ocean region. And I think all of us again need to look back at the map that you showed in the first slide to look at the geographic challenges that China faces. If they have to come all the way to Indian Ocean region, one is, of course, they have to overcome the Malacca dilemma. Or even if they, let's say, for example, take the Lumbar Strait or some other strait, it's going to take them a long time, which is why they've realized that they need Gwadar, they need Hambantota, they need Djibouti, etc., etc. So in terms of being ready to take on China, I think we are quite well off. When it comes to the mix of vessels, the Indian Navy, I think by and large has managed its assets well. For nuclear deterrence, we have our own nuclear submarines which are made in-house with certain amount of technical assistance from others. And the carrier has come out. The decision on the next carrier again is there. And please remember, just as the Indian aircraft carrier, whether it's Vikramaditya or Vikrant, has not gone in recent time to South China Sea or the East Pacific, the Chinese Navy, the PLA Navy, has not ventured into Indian Ocean region with its carrier force. Some of their smaller vessels have been coming here. Their research vessels have come to Kampantota. Their patrol ships are carrying out patrols of Somalia. But the point is that, numerically, you may be superior to USA. 380 odd ships which they have. But the fact that geographically they are, having issues of coming all the way is something that works in our favor. Indian Navy has launched its 24/7 missions in 8 important points. which I wrote about it as the camping missions of India. So, we are trying to secure this, and we also know that we don't have 1,000 ships. So if you do not have 1,000 ships, if America does not have 1,000 ships, if Australia does not have 1,000 ships, if Japan does not have 1,000 ships, the best option is for all of us to work together, which is where some of the foundational agreements that we have with America, whether it's the LIMOA or the CARTSA or various other options, they provide us these kind of options to overcome these disadvantages of number. Another point that's important is that while China may say that have numbers more than America, what is the quality of those ships? They have the nuclear carriers of the size of USA. They're looking at 96,000-ton nuclear ships. They do not have those ships. So they're confined to the Pacific. They're just about looking at overcoming the disadvantages of the first and second line chains. So, and if you also have illegally acquired property or assets in Spratly Islands and this, you need forces to protect them. So I have calculated and said that something like 30% of the PLA Navy will be confined to the South China Sea because they are required to protect these assets. So they are left with only 50 to 60% more to be deployed overseas. That is a limitation by itself. And the logistic chain is a long supply chain. So it's not easy to overcome these kind of challenges at sea. Be able to supply fuel, munitions, provide them rest and recreational facility, food, satellite coverage, protection of the ships which are coming. It's not an easy task. Navy is not an easy job. I've been in the Navy for 34 years. So therefore, there are challenges, and we know what these challenges are which are faced by them. And we know our own challenges in our backyard. And coming back to your question of what more should we invest in, we must have a balanced Navy. More importantly, we should now invest in high-end technology weapons, high-end technology surveillance system, what is typically called the C4ISR system. Therefore, greater focus on overcoming cyber weaknesses, cyber security weaknesses, space-based missions which are there where we are interacting. So the whole domain is not limited to just undersea, oversea, and above, but it has transcended these barriers of warfare into outer space and also into the cyber domain. So we need to be ready and prepared, equipped in this. So that's where the money should go. Training, equipping, building capacities and capabilities.
Thank you, Commodore Vasan. My next question goes to Ambassador Trigunayat. Ambassador Trigunayat, you have a long span of diplomatic experience. So the question is challenging some of the diplomatic wisdom has become almost a rhetoric or a mantra about centrality of ASEAN in Indo-Pacific. If you look at the reality, ASEAN is a conspicuous failure. ASEAN has not been able to solve intra-ASEAN problems. ASEAN is very indecisive, is not able to make any decision whatsoever. So it becomes a singing and dancing shop, the ASEAN meetings. There's hardly any, achievement to ASEAN's credit except for economic development. Now, in that scenario, Indo-Pacific challenge is a much wider challenge. Rather than the rest of the world keep on humoring ASEAN on their egoistic trip about centrality of ASEAN, shouldn't we get real and say that PIF also matters? PIF standing for Pacific Islands Forum, IORA, that is a regional stakeholder. So rather than holding the Indo-Pacific to ransom in any security dialogue, should not ASEAN be told gently that centrality of ASEAN is really not centrality of ASEAN? Threats have changed, the challenges have changed, and somebody has to bell the cat.
Well, you can bell the cat, but if the cat is resident in that neighborhood, then you got to cultivate the cat. It is very important. I mean, irrespective of the fact that we might say ASEAN, to a great extent, is a success story, even though they worked with consensus and have not been able to resolve all their internal dynamics. fact remains is why only accuse ASEAN of being somewhat lackadaisical. In fact, look at the Americans. I mean, they are also trying to have the same kind of competition cooperation paradigm. Look at India. We also want continuing to have a dialogue with the Chinese despite the problems and the dragon being in the room everywhere. Look at Japan for that matter, or look at every other country, Australia. So the thing is that you're right. I mean, we have seen the Pacific nations recently. I mean, there have been a very big contestation between the Americans and the Chinese. And India has also been there. And India, in fact, is very much looked up by the Pacific countries, all 14 of them. You know, when Prime Minister was in Papua New Guinea, Prime Minister Modi, they all wanted India to be the voice of their global south. So all those countries are ready to stand with you. But then overall, the strategic location might be very important. So I think that instead of either or kind of a situation, we would need to look at how more we can do it. You see, the ASEAN, like every other trade matters, economic engagement matters. And today, China is the biggest partner for all the countries we are talking about. I mean, their trade, despite all competition, has grown with the United States, has grown with India, has grown with the other ASEAN countries. And with the ASEAN, we want to engage with China, not confront directly. That is something which has been very much there. But at the same time, they are also cautious. So instead of directly belling the case, they are not in a position to do that. So they need that assistance and help and guidance. And of course, they have their own ADD and what kind of several mechanisms. And they know that all the major powers are invested there, within the ASEAN summit and all, whatever happens. So I think that we cannot dispense with them in any way or tell them that they are not doing, because see, no organization internally is perfect. Most important is each nation looks at its own interest. I would go to the extent of saying that this essentially is a major contestation in the Indo-Pacific is between USA and China. That's it. That is for their own supremacy, from number 2 to number 1 position. The rest of the other countries are trying to play the symphony.
Thank you, Ambassador Terunayat. My next question goes to Professor Sato. Professor Sato, kindly unmute yourself. Professor Sato, I have been kind of advocating for middle country cooperation. And, you know, India and Japan are facing similar kind of strategic challenges from a rising hegemon. And Japanese defense forces are now, you know, strengthening and, you know, increasing. In that situation, there is something that India has that Japan might like to take benefit. You know, India has long experience of handling aircraft carriers. Right now has 2 aircraft carriers, one of them indigenously built, 40,000 displacement, Vikrant, third carrier on the anvil or planning stage. Whereas Japan, the largest is a helicopter carrier, 27,000 ton displacement, Izumo. Would it make sense for Japan to enter into bilateral security collaboration and build a Japanese aircraft carrier with Indian assistance, technological and otherwise? Again, spirit of middle country cooperation, leaving aside the superpowers.
Interesting question. It's been a while that Japan has not had an aircraft carrier. Japan is coming back as a major operator of aircraft carrier. During the World War II, the Japanese carrier task force were active in both the Pacific and the Indian Oceans. And Japan is retrofitting one of the 2 flat deck destroyer ships. They call it destroyers, but it's a helicopter carrier. Now it's being converted for loading with the F-35B aircraft, the plane. So Japan will use this as a kind of the practice port. And the next development is likely a real aircraft carrier that Japan will have after retrofitting the current two vessels, Kaga and Izumo. So we'll probably be looking at something like 10-year span before Japan becomes a major aircraft carrier operator. With the doubling of the defense budget toward 2035, it's likely to happen. So Japan and India cooperate for sort of improving the carrier operating capabilities. I'm pretty sure there are many things the two countries can cooperate. I think the one issue that remains is that Japan is an ally of the United States and India is not. And improving interoperability with India may cause some issues in terms of technology confidentiality between United States and Japan. On the ground, we all know that India's S-400 missile from Russia is basically preventing the major cooperation between the Indian Air Force and the US or Japanese Air Force. So I think that on the maritime domain, the similar things could happen and limit the scope of bilateral cooperation between India and Japan.
My next question goes to Komodo Wasan. Komodo Wasan, kindly unmute yourself. Okay. So China has been, whatever you call it, string of pearls or whatever, has been a spree of developing military bases, naval bases, wherever it can find, whether it is Hambantota, whether it is Djibouti, whether it's Chittagong, whether it is Port of Sittwe in Myanmar or Coco Islands. China has been on a spree. And deal with that counter challenge, India has to get its act together. India is also currently a rising maritime power. If you were advising the government of India, would you consider an idea of India entering into a bilateral agreement with the Russian Federation to have some sort of naval base facility for India in the port of Vladivostok? Keep an eye on China.
A very interesting question. Looking at the future landscape of emerging security scenario, Russia, we've had excellent relations, and Ambassador Trigonath, who's also worked there, will continue to tell you that there are a lot of things which are still intact, despite the differences that we have because of the recent Ukraine aggression. So our military dependence is still very high with Russia. Our strategic partnership has stood the test of times. And we also have an alliance with Vladivostok, where we did show our interest in Vladivostok, and we are looking at the complete passage from Chennai to Vladivostok, which is going to connect the two countries. Therefore, having some kind of a port support or a naval support to our units, a monitoring station or whatever you want to call it, can definitely be looked at in the future plans, as and when we open, because our relations are good. But at the moment, the time may not be right. because we are still trying to cultivate our neighborhood first. We are looking at engaging with Middle East. We are trying to have relations with Oman to develop Dukum. We are also looking at Mauritius. We are looking at Maldives. We are looking at Sri Lanka. We are looking at Bangladesh in terms of connectivity and also being able to use some of their ports as required. Indonesia is the new chapter which everybody is aware of, where we are trying to have a military base. So we are first trying to concentrate in the immediate neighborhood of India. And as far as I am concerned, Indonesia is the immediate neighborhood. After all, it's just a stone's throw away from Indira Point. People tend to try and call it as forest, which is a UK definition. It is not forest anymore, at least for India. It is our immediate neighborhood. So therefore, there are developments in our neighborhood. Which also brings us back to a point that you raised earlier on ASEAN plus plus. Both South Korea and Singapore have shown interest to be part of the Quad plus plus. So Singapore is after all part of the ASEAN grouping. South Korea has also shown interest, and because of various reasons. So we need to be initially looking at our immediate neighborhood, secure our interests here first, and thereafter look beyond this, where Vladivostok could be on the map of our interest definitely, but not immediately in the next 5 years. I'm putting a time frame of, let's say, 7 to 10 years for us to sustain our interest and have something that's going in Vladivostok. But it also depends on what are the outcomes of the present standoff with Ukraine, because a lot of things that are happening there. So yes, it must definitely be in our long-term plans. It is of our great interest to us, particularly when you are trying to sustain your economy trade movement through the South China Sea and through the Taiwan Straits. So it is important to us, and I'm sure, like you said, if I have to advise the government, I definitely would say keep it pending. Don't put it in the folded folder and put it away, but keep it active and see what options are there which are unfolding in terms of the strategic landscape that is evolving on a daily basis.
Thank you, Commodore Bhaskar.
If I may add, this is also very important. India is already engaged as far as the Arctic strategy is concerned.
Exactly. We have finished the moderated round, and there are some questions in the chat room from the audience. And some of these issues we have already discussed, so I'm not going to repeat. But there's a question I would like to ask Professor Sato. I'll just paraphrase the question, which is from an audience by name Bhagwat. It is very, very likely that China will use military operations in Taiwan, whether in 2027 or some other time of Xi Jinping's choice. If that were to happen, United States would be forced to have direct conflict with China. Would Japan join the United States in such a futuristic scenario on Taiwan conflict?
I think Japan is making every effort to be ready if that happens. And legislation since the late 1990s have addressed the issue of defense cooperation between the US forces and the Japanese self-defense forces in contingency. And although the government has been tight-lipped about the specific geographic application of many of the legislations, is speculated by many analysts that both contingency on the Korean Peninsula and contingency over Taiwan Straits are the most direct concerns for Japan, which Japan feels it's absolutely necessary that the self-defense forces assist the US forces. But Japan has been, however, reluctant to be in the front line and using kind of offensive capabilities of the self-defense forces in either contingency. Japan has been trying to keep itself to the role of real support to the U.S. forces. But, has been changing since under the Prime Minister Abe's efforts to reinterpret the Constitution and enabling collective defense between not only Japan and the US, but also Japan and other US allies like Australia. So in conclusion, I think Japan will play an important role if war ever breaks out over the Taiwan Strait.
Thank you, Professor Sato, for a very honest answer. I guess everyone was waiting to hear that answer. There are a couple of more questions. I will summarily mention them. There's not a question, but a comment from Tapan Jatakia about alternative supply chains, about semiconductors. And yes, efforts are on way, and India is being considered as an alternative to Taiwan in case conflict happens. There is some investment happening. Foxconn and United States is thinking in terms of. So yes, that's a fair comment, but everybody knows about it. There is a question from Kyle Marston from Boston, and that is about India trying to develop as an alternative to China in Africa with a different model of investment, because Chinese efforts are exploitative and extractive in nature. So whether India will invest in East African nations like Mozambique, Kenya, and Madagascar. So maybe Ambassador Trigunayat and Komodo Wasan can expand on it. But there is an India-Africa summit, and India has an ongoing engagement with Africa, with various countries. But maybe both of you can comment on Kyle Marston's question.
Well, I think that the question is absolutely valid. And as I told in the beginning, as far as India's Indo-Pacific strategy is concerned, Eastern Africa plays a very important role. Is in that context, India is continuing to work very closely with all the countries that have been mentioned, and on various projects, be it in the infrastructure, ports, and others. And we have had many high-level visits. Africa is the next opportunity, best opportunity. And India is trying very hard now under its own G20 presidency, bring African Union as a member, which will make G20 into G21. So India has an umbilical relationship as far as Africa is concerned. Of course, we did not have a very succinct, well-articulated policy with regard to Africa. We've been providing capacity building assistance since 1964. And the majority of the countries who benefited are in Africa. So we are working with Japan, we are working with US, we are working with Germany, France, in these countries, in many countries in Africa, including in Djibouti for that matter. So I think that both in the Indo-Pacific domain, as well as in the bilateral domain as far as India-Africa relations are concerned, and you mentioned about the summit that might be held by the end of the year, again, the fourth one. The relationship has strongly moved forward, and perhaps you are aware that one of the biggest deficits in our Africa policy used to be we did not have any articulation of the policy, which was done by Prime Minister Modi when he went to Kampala, the Ugandan Parliament in 2018, and number of visits they've undertaken in the past 6-7 years have created that kind of a confidence. And the Africans really want India to play a much greater role now than it was done before.
Vasan, do you want to make any comment on that?
I just want to compliment what Ambassador has made, very valid points. India is now shaping to be the voice of the global south. From that point of view, to include African Union and African countries is a masterstroke in my opinion, because after all, we need to lend our voice to supporting these initiatives in Africa. On the other side, we also are looking at dependency on China for rare earth, which was a feature. So many of the African countries are rich in rare earths, and so that will complement our efforts to diversify sourcing of REs, particularly in some of these countries where the survey has clearly indicated that they are rich with these earths, and they're looking for investments from India. We may not be able to match what China has done in terms of investments, but there is phenomenal amount of goodwill. I can tell you that some 30 years ago, 40 years ago, the Nigerian Navy, all the personnel were trained in India. And one of the chiefs who came to Cochin when I was CSO Ops said, we would like all our people to be trained by Indian Navy. So that's the kind of goodwill that generates as far as Indian practices, the ethos are concerned, and we are not cashed on it. To be frank with you, I don't think we cashed enough, whether it's because of the economic differential that we have with China or because of various other factors. We've not really taken the lead, and I think, in my assessment, the time is overdue. It's long overdue, and we need to start investing in Africa, both in terms of soft power as well as in terms of hard power. And also, in this context, since there is a Japanese professor here, I would like to again bring your attention to the fact that the AAGC is languishing. The so-called Asia-Africa Growth Corridor is languishing. There's not any movement at all, because there are a lot of noise that was made to say that India and Japan will provide alternatives to the African countries for developing the growth corridors to invest in the developing countries. It's not happened. Maybe India and Japan will have to revisit the AAGC in its entirety and see why it's not taken off.
Thank you very much indeed to our three distinguished panelists. The job of a think tank is to churn ideas that are unconventional. My effort has been that we bring ideas that may seem unconventional, but have a future security bearing. And in that sense, we had a wonderful discussion with three great panelists who showed open-mindedness and candor in this discussion. So I'm very thankful to all three of them. I'm thankful to our audience who took 1.5 hours of their time on a weekend to discuss this particular topic. I'm also thankful to Team CSA, especially Mr. Ripudaman Pachori, who helps me with these programs. So we have run out of time. Again, thank you very much indeed. And I hope that Professor Sato will take some of these ideas to Japanese think tanks and Japanese government and think in terms of middle country collaboration rather than superpower and Japan collaboration, because they are not at the expense of each other. There is a room and space for growth and ideas of other ideas in geopolitics if we have to survive the security challenges. So with those comments, I thank you all, and we are going to close this discussion. Namaste.
Thank you, Namaskar.
Thank you very much. Jai Hind. Namaste.
Thank you, Jai Hind.